start recording. You keep saying what you're saying. I just didn't want to forget.
Well, now it just feels awkward to continue.
Now, if someone watches or something, I got my wife a Christmas gift. I got her like shoes, or this is part of it. And so like, I just got an email saying it was here, and like homegirl gets off work in a bit. So I'm like, what do I do with this? Like, I'm like scrambling, like, where do I put this? Like,
I didn't draw. No.
It's like really obvious. It says like Steve Madden shoes on it, like in big font. I don't know what to do.
Hide in a tree.
Wait, what shoes did you get her?
They're these.
Oh,
they're
cute.
like little boots. Yeah.
Good job.
Thanks.
That's funny. I just got some Steve Maddens in the mail today too.
Oh yeah, Steve Madden's dope. They make good guys shoes too. They make really nice shoes.
I've always loved Steve Madden, even since I was a kid. Great shoes.
And they're not super expensive for like, I mean, I guess they can get expensive, but for like the higher end type shoes that they are, they're not horribly expensive.
Yeah, they're not crazy expensive, which is nice.
Okay. And then we're also waiting on Howard too. I sent him the Zoom link a little while ago, so hopefully he comes.
Otherwise, we just talk about shoes. High Level
Yeah,
Philosophy
exactly.
Club, where we talk about the philosophy of shoes.
Yeah.
Love shoes.
Yeah, I'm gonna go find a bag. Give me 1 sec.
But yeah, what are your guys' plans for the 4-day break? 4-week, I wish.
Eating.
Nice.
What are yours?
Straightforward. That's all there is
Probably
to it.
revising essays.
Yeah, I feel.
Fun.
I know. I feel like this break is kind of bittersweet because like it's nice to have a break, but also I have like it's getting to the end of the quarter, so everyone has like so much shit to do that like you feel like you can't really relax.
It's not a break.
Yeah.
Really, yeah.
It's just a few extra days to get your work done.
Yeah.
Really.
Wait, Satar, you're a psychology major, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, what lab? Do you work in any labs?
I used to work in Dr. Sai's lab, but now I'm in ecology lab, which is
Nice.
random. But yeah, I used to work in Dr. Sai's lab. I didn't enjoy that lab too much, to be honest, because all they did was use RStudio, and I hate RStudio. So
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone worked with R, but
Yeah, I just applied to a few labs and I had like an interview, I think a week ago.
cool.
Like for Kate Sweeney's lab, social psychology lab.
Oh yeah, I heard she's dope.
Yeah, so I hope I get in. The interview went really good. Turns out they know about Schutz-Gable.
About what? What'd you
It's
say?
like, yeah, he's a philosophy professor who works on like social and developmental psychology.
Oh, cool. I think, to be honest, I have a bunch of like sorority sisters that work in Dr. Sweeney's lab, and like they say it's a great time, so I'm sure you'd love it.
Nice.
I'm sure you will.
Okay. How's it going, Dr. Wettstein? Wettstein, excuse me. Yeah, and then I also classic Gerardo never sent out my email. So that's 2 meetings in a row. But so it wasn't circulated through Phil majors, unfortunately, just through the club. But I did get a hold of my religious studies advisor, and he emailed it out to religious studies students. So I figured it was kind of a mid ground there. And then of course, even though he's my academic advisor for my minor, he emailed me back like immediately. And then of course never heard from Gerardo. So
See, I could have done that, or I could have told him to email it out. I met with him like a few days ago, just to discuss like a double major.
Oh yeah, it's fine. It's Gerardo. He'll get to it in a couple months.
Sends it out like 4 weeks from now. Hey guys, we got a second philosophy club meeting.
But okay, so let's go ahead and start, and people might trickle in as well, as per usual. But we can kind of start how we normally do, right? Which is introduce ourselves popcorn style. Our majors, our name, our major, maybe what we're interested in our major. And then that's it. Anyway, so I'll go first. I'm Kevin. You might have gotten my emails. The president of the philosophy club, so I annoy you guys all the time. Other than that, I'm a film major and religious studies minor, and my focus or my interests are usually on ethics and actually philosophy of religion. So this will be interesting for me. Otherwise, let's see. I will call on Omar if you're there.
I am here. Hello, I'm Omar. I am I guess a second year psych major now. And I like philosophy. I'm interested in psychoanalysis when it comes to psychology. I'm also interested in virtue when it comes to philosophy, and I'm hoping to find a connection between the psychology and the philosophy of virtue someday.
Nice.
Oh yeah, and I'll pick Rotem.
Howie, by the way, I can see that you're talking, but your mic's not on. You're muted. Yeah, Howie. But hi, I'm Rotem. I'm a grad student in the philosophy department. I'm in my 6th year, and I work on philosophy of mind and cog sci and psychology, and I'm starting to develop some interest in phenomenology. Devoted Wettstein disciple. I'm here. So I'll call on Satare.
Those of you who are not using your cameras, if you could, that would be great. If you can't, I'll understand, of course. Satara, hi.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Satari. I am a 4th year psychology major. Pre-med, though, I'm a research fellow, so I study climate change and how that affects pollination and all that jazz. But specifically in the realm of philosophy, I'm interested in existentialism, aesthetics. Yeah, and then I'll call on Nathan.
Hello, I'm a 2nd year political science major.
Okay.
And I like to study law and within philosophy. Well, I'm planning to take philosophy and law next quarter, so I'm excited for that.
Okay. Can I see a picture, or is it not convenient?
It's not really convenient right now. My bad.
Okay, that's no problem.
Well, Nathan, if you want to call on someone else, those who haven't gone yet are Adam, Nick, and Julio.
All right, I'll call on Julio.
Hi, my name is Julio. I'm a philosophy major. I'm interested in things that have to do with theology and Thomism and that kind of stuff. And yeah.
Okay.
Calling Nick.
Yeah, cool. My name is Nick. I'm a 2nd year philosophy major. My interests in philosophy are philosophy of mind, existentialism, stoicism, and a bit of mental health around there. So yeah. Who's left? Is it Nathan? No, Nathan.
Is your first name that of the golfer?
Yeah, actually. My parents play golf. Yeah,
Whoa.
Jack Nicklaus. I don't play golf, ironically, so.
That's funny. This fellow a lovely guy in the religious studies department named Muhammad Ali. He was named after the boxer.
Yeah, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think it is cool.
I wonder if he boxes then.
I don't think so.
That's unfortunate.
And then Adam, you're last if you'd like to go too.
Best for last, of course. So I am Adam, philosophy major. What am I? It's my 4th year, I guess. Interests are primarily ethics, aesthetics. I actually kind of got started in Thomism, as Julio had mentioned, and then through successive stages have kind of found my way to phenomenology. So that's kind of the main
How come
approach.
Thomas? Where'd that start?
In a Catholic seminary, which tends to specialize in Thomism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're a seminarian?
Previously, I was for about 4 years after graduating high school, and then
No kidding. That's
Yeah.
great. Julio, how about you and Thomism?
I recently started a couple months back. It was more of a getting into my faith and like looking at
Mhm.
Thomas Aquinas and his work.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, we had a fellow who taught in the philosophy department for 2 years named Mark Ravisa, and he quit to become a priest. He's a Jesuit, and he teaches philosophy at Santa Clara.
Yeah, Dr. Fisher talks about him
Yeah.
quite often. Dr.
Yeah.
Fisher is good friends with him.
Yeah, I
Pretty
know.
good other
Me too.
sentence.
Me too. Omar, I think you and I have met. Is that right? Yeah. I enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, we were supposed to meet again, but then the
Yep.
COVID thing hit and it all got ruined, but
Didn't
we
happen.
reunited.
Let me open my window. It's a little warm. Okay. So let me tell you a little about me. I've taught in various places around the country. I grew up in New York. My first job was in Minnesota, and I was in Iowa for a while, and then Northern California, then Notre Dame before I came here. I'm not Catholic. In fact, I knew I had made it though when some kid called me father. I'm Jewish in terms of my background and religious practice. So after Notre Dame, I got a call from somebody here who was teaching here and who said they wanted to build a really good graduate department. And that was always a dream of mine. The dream was to create a department that I'd like to be in as a student. Now, I don't know if Rotem would attest to that or not, but there you go. But it's quite a nice department relative to what I had experienced, at least. So I was chair of the department for a few years, and then I was director of the honors program for a while. But after doing that for a while, I decided that I wanted to just stick to teaching and writing, and it's been a good decision. And I love my life. I mean, I spend time talking philosophy with guys, and it's good. It's good. My first love was in philosophy was philosophy of language, and I spent probably 15 years or more than that working on philosophy of language, writing a PhD dissertation, and then a couple of books. At a certain point, I should tell you about my religious background. I come from a Jewish family, but they were not at all involved in religion. And so I had no connection with it. I really didn't have a feel for it at all, except I had grandparents who were serious about it. And that made me think it's for old people. And then I was a really shitty student in high school. And the best college I could get into was a Jewish college called Yeshiva in New York. And the minute I got there, I saw what religion was and I got very excited and I really got into it. Ancient languages and texts and stuff. And it was really interesting to me. At the same time, I didn't really have let's see how to put it. Religion was really interesting and the intellectual community was really interesting, but I wasn't easy with believing in God. I didn't know how you're supposed to make sense of this. So it got me into philosophy, and I would spend endless hours in the dorm at night talking to people about these things. And it was a real education. It was fantastic. So I ended up being quite engaged in Jewish life in terms of scholarship and in terms of practice. And I even entered a rabbinical program, like sort of like your seminary. And I started it and I spent a year, and then I had a kind of crisis of faith. And I decided I couldn't really support the theological position that that would be necessary for me to do this. And I dropped out completely. I dropped out of religious life. I dropped out of the scholarship stuff in that domain. And I went to graduate school in philosophy. Graduate school in philosophy was a wipeout. It was terrible. It was unfriendly and unsupportive. And my undergraduate years, my teachers were fantastic. They cared about us and it was really good. And graduate school was just the opposite. They were cold and I don't know what. So I survived it because I love philosophy so much. If I didn't love philosophy so much, I never would have survived it because it was painful and unpleasant. And then towards the end of my graduate career, I had started kind of toying around with a dissertation topic. And a professor of mine told me that I should go to the American Philosophical Association convention and apply for jobs. There were very few jobs around. And he thought it would be a good practice for me because the following year or the year after, I'd be finished and ready to teach. And maybe I'd get an interview and like that. It turns out I got a job. So my wife and I moved to Minnesota, Western Minnesota, which was the kind of prairie country. There were more people in my building in Manhattan than there were in the whole town that we moved to. And the biggest structure was a grain elevator. So we were there for 6 years, a long time. And I actually liked it a lot. My wife hated it. It was kind of very bad for a spouse. But the students were smart and interesting, and I got to teach what I wanted to teach. And a famous philosopher from UCLA, David Kaplan, once came to visit us there. We had a good colloquium program. We raised some money to bring in people because we felt like there were only 3 of us in philosophy there. And we wanted to keep it alive. So David Kaplan once came and he saw what I was teaching and he said, you know, we'd never teach that to undergraduates. Like I was teaching them stuff I was really interested in learning with them. So it was an interesting program. We started a journal there that's become a kind of big deal for all these years. And eventually I left and I got a job at Notre Dame. And stayed there until this friend called me and said they were trying to build something at Riverside, and I really wanted to be part of that. So I've been here for a long time now. And in the middle of it, I found myself drawn to religion again for the first time in 20, 25 years. And I didn't know what that was about because it wasn't about a metaphysics of typical Orthodox religion. It wasn't about belief in God exactly, but something was drawing me back, really interested in what that was and what was going on. A bunch of things happened in my life that sort of pushed me in that direction as well. And I called a friend who was a dean at NYU, and I said to him, Rotem might know this story. I said to him, you know, my colleagues are going to think I'm nuts. Until yesterday, I was thinking about philosophy of language, reference and meaning, and now I'm thinking about God. So he said, you have tenure, right? So I said, yeah. So he said, fuck him. I think that was great advice. So, so I started teaching and thinking about philosophy of religion, writing papers that developed as I developed. In other words, at first I thought of myself as a religious atheist, whatever that means, and maybe we'll come to that. But little by little, I got more into it, and it was a kind of religious naturalism that appealed to me. Now that sounds like a funny expression because naturalism usually means someone who thinks all there is nature. And often naturalists are reductionists. They want to kind of reduce the mind to the brain and the like. And so it's hard to see how that would work with religion. So we'll talk about that. But that's the kind of, I'm a religious person and I'm a naturalist in some way, whatever that is. I hate ist words, but what are you going to do? What that really means is, in my head, there's no room for, I can't do the supernatural. That's not my picture. It seems like a kind of mythology to me. And the question is, how do you have reverence for religion and really take it very seriously while not not thinking in terms of the supernatural. So just to give you a little taste of that, in typical Orthodox religious thinking in any of the, in Islam and in Judaism and in Christianity, we think of the supernatural as a kind of domain that's not the same as the natural world. And God, so to speak, lives in such a domain or exists in such a domain. And maybe souls do after they die, maybe, I don't know, whatever. Anyway, this feels fake to me. I mean, I don't know what this domain would be. It's as if God is composed of stuff, just not our stuff, the stuff of spirit. And I don't know what that would mean. So this whole thing doesn't really, that way of looking doesn't do it for me. So whereas usually we think of the transcendent, God is, I remember somebody telling me in my freshman year that God was both transcendent and immanent. Transcendent meant supernatural, and immanent meant somehow in the world at the same time. And the kind of idea I like is to start with transcendence instead of starting with the supernatural. That if you think about transcendence in a human way, the way sometimes you may feel like a work of art transcends the world in some sense, or a person self-transcends, kind of reaches heights that she never dreamt of, right? I think of the supernatural in terms of that instead of the other way around. In other words, instead of thinking of transcendence as really just the supernatural, I think of talk of the supernatural as a way to, it gets started for me by thinking about human transcendence. There's an article, there's a book I love by the basketball player Bill Russell, an old guy now, and he talks about transcendence in sport, and it's really fascinating. If anybody's interested, let me know, and I will send that to you. Okay, so when I start thinking about religion, I start thinking about the Old Testament and the fact that there's very little theory in it. There's just, it's poetry and poetically infused narrative. And this is true a lot of the New Testament until you get to John. John becomes very theoretical. And I don't know the Quran as well as I'd like to, but I suspect it's true of the Quran as well. There's not so much theory as there, I'm not sure about the Quran. Maybe you can correct me if you know. So when I say there's not so much theory, I mean, there's talk about God. There's no definition of what God is. There's no statement that he's omniscient and omnipotent and all those things that we think ever since medieval theology got a hold of us. God's powerful for sure. He knows a lot, but who knows? And he's not ethically perfect in the Bible. He changes his mind about stuff, and he gets kind of mean at times. And a favorite book of mine, just to emphasize this kind of point, it's really a point about anthropomorphism, if you know that word. It means, right, seeing something in the form of people. So the Bible talks about God in very human terms. When it's right, God loves, and God's angry, and God regrets at times, and he asks people questions like, where are you? So it doesn't sound like he knows everything, and various things. We've been taught by our churches to read the Bible a certain way, so we don't take that too seriously. But the text itself, if you just look at it, looks very different than what theology teaches us. So I had a student from Loma Linda who was an Adventist, and we were talking about this, that if you read the Bible, really read the Bible, not for what it's supposed to mean according to your church, but just read it. It doesn't look like that. That's not a proof that your church is wrong by any means, but it is very interesting just to see what it seems to say. Okay, so one of my favorite books in this domain is the book of Hosea. Hosea, do you know that book? Adam? Yeah. So the book of Hosea, God tells the prophet to marry a whore. And you wonder what in the world is going on. And as you read along, it appears that God wants the prophet to understand what it's like for God to be married to Israel. Right? So that's kind of the punchline. And God is so humanized in that book. At one moment he says, I'm going to kill her and all her lovers, meaning Israel and the idol communities, idolatrous communities. And sometimes he says, I love her so much, I'm going to win her back and do whatever it takes. And it bounces back and forth between these kind of things. And it's telling us something important about passion and about our passion for God and God's passion for us. So anyway, I take the Old Testament seriously in this way. Now, as you move along in the history of religion from there, when you get to Augustine and St. Thomas, and then in my tradition, Maimonides, who learned a lot of his stuff from the Arab world, you get increasingly theoretical treatments of these things. So, you know, the Bible, when you ask who God is, when Moses asked God, who are you? He gets it thrown back in his face in a way. He says, I am who I am. And now theologians want to understand that as a kind of hidden definition almost. Like if you really think about it, you'll see, but really it sounds on the face of it like a joke, almost like a rejection of the question. And then he says, but no man can see my face and live, God says to Moses. What's the first commandment of the 10?
I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, etc.
Yeah.
Paraphrased.
Good. So you shall is a commandment in a way, but the first part is thought of often as the first commandment, or at least, right? So what's the command there? I am the Lord your God who took you out of Egypt and so on. Why is it a command? Is it a command? So in the Old Testament, the people kind of live with God in a way. They live in God's presence. And I am the Lord your God sounds like an introduction to who I am. Doesn't tell you a lot of the things that the theologians were interested in, but it sounds like an introduction. Now, in medieval times, various theologians took this to be a commandment to believe in God. Now, that's weird in a lot of directions. One reason it's weird is because if I don't believe in God, who's commanding me? So is it coherent to command someone to believe in God? So belief, theoretical belief becomes really important in medieval times from then on in the way we understand religion. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, there's no word for belief. That strikes people as very weird, right? There's a word for faith. There's a word for a kind of attitude to God that involves loyalty and trust and a lot of things in that domain, but they're more affective / cognitive things. They're not like belief, like there's a proposition and I take it to be true. The Bible doesn't know that kind of talk. And that's really significant, I think. Whereas by the time you get to medieval times, it becomes all about belief. So much so that in my own tradition, Maimonides reinterprets idolatry to be having false beliefs about God instead of what it originally meant, which was bowing down. It's a kind of practice, a behavior. Okay. So I'm really into this. I feel like when it comes to religion, the best way for me to think about it is the practice, meaning prayer and treating people a certain way and study, whatever it takes. The practice drives whatever kind of theorizing you want to do if you're in philosophy. Whereas the way it's usually done is the theory drives the practice. You have a belief in an omniscient God, and that's the foundation. Okay, so that's what I think about. And I've been, it's a kind of, there was I can put this online or send it to somebody. There was an interview I gave a guy who was my colleague at Notre Dame, was interviewing people online, and he wanted to know whether if I'm really naturalistically inclined, I don't have the supernatural in my picture at all. What do I do? Do I think God exists? If so, what are we talking about? So there are two questions there. Does he exist, and what are we talking about? About what we're talking about, let me do that one first. I feel like I don't know what I'm talking about. So I said to a student who asked me, like, if you don't have these doctrines that tell you what God is, how do you do anything? How do you pray? So I said to her, prayer is really hard. And when it works for a person, you feel like you're really doing something significant and almost or actually somehow in contact, and you don't like that. And if you're tapping on the shoulder and say, tell me about this person you've been in contact with, I have nothing to say much. What am I going to say? So they asked Mother Teresa, I love this story. They asked Mother Teresa that you spend a lot of time praying. What do you pray exactly? What do you ask for? And she said, I listen, which for me is a great answer. And then somebody said to her, well, okay, what do you hear? What does God say? And she said, he listens. So it was a picture of kind of shared intimacy rather than straightforward communication as with me and you. Okay, so the truth is, I don't much know what I'm talking about. And I really mean that. I mean, what am I doing when I pray? Santayana, who I'm teaching at the moment, George Santayana, who was a philosopher in the 20th century, thought that we don't emphasize prayer as soliloquy enough. We think of it as commercial transaction, like, I ask for this and I get that. He says it's more like pouring out your heart to the universe. And that I get. That I really get. There was a guy here from Northwestern, a philosopher, who gave a talk about the ethics of address. Like when I walk into a room and address Omar, if I address him, it's not ethical for me to then turn around and walk away, nor is it ethical for him to ignore me. So one of the central prayers that I say every day starts with Adonai, which means Lord. If you start the prayer with that, and it's a comma after it, it's not like a part of a sentence that says, something about God. It's just a call. It's sort of like walking into a room and saying, Omar. And it occurred to me after hearing this guy's talk that I should take that one word much more seriously. That is, when I say it, I'm really doing something significant. I'm addressing God, as it were. Okay. So it changed my whole way of approaching this prayer. Okay. Okay. The other question, so what are you talking about? And do you think God exists? So I quoted Richard Feynman, the great physicist and mathematician, who said two things about numbers. Okay, numbers 1 through whatever. Okay, he said, I don't just prove theorems about the numbers, I live among them. And he meant that he had a kind of intimacy with this domain. his head was so focused on it that it's as if he knew them, you know, exaggeration, but you get the idea. And I said there was somebody I knew in Jerusalem, a rabbi actually, died some years ago, who was like that with God. When I was with this guy, I felt like he was intimate. And yet both Feynman and this rabbi had no patience for the philosophical questions of whether the thing exists. Feynman said, I don't know what the philosophers are talking about when they talk about these abstract things exist. What exactly do you want to know? And I feel that way about God, right? I don't know about existence. It doesn't feel like the right idea for me. But that God is very real to me is very important. Now, I don't know if that will resonate or not. I can send you the interview. Anyway, you're getting the flavor, I hope, of the picture I have and the way I approach this. So as I approach it, doctrine is not a giant thing for me. That somehow the whole thing is more impressionistic. It's more like an art form. In other words, sometimes you read a novel, and although a lot of the sentences are false because they're talking about fictional things, or they're not false, or they're worse than false, whatever they are, you feel like there are deep truths in this novel, even though the novel may never say what they are exactly. That's how I feel about the Bible. I don't know that I think that it's an account of actual creation or not, but there are deep truths in that first chapter or two about humanity and about how to be. So anyway, that's the kind of picture I work with. And maybe I'll stop here. I can say more, but let me stop here and see about reactions and questions and criticisms and anything you like.
I had a question. This is going a good bit back, but into the conversation.
Oh, sure.
From my recollection, and it's been a while since I've been to church or read the Bible, but from my recollection, it seems a lot like the Old Testament and the New Testament have very different depictions of God. You had mentioned how God seems very human in a lot of ways, getting angry and maybe doing things that we might consider unethical even. Seems as though that is relegated to the Old Testament. Can it be really accurate to even consider these two people the same God, right? Because they seem so different.
Good question. So when I was growing up, I think it's correct. I'm certainly not an expert in this. I think it's correct that was the picture. The picture was that the New Testament supplants the Old Testament, the Christian picture. So a few years back, there was a conference at Notre Dame. After I came to Riverside, there was a conference about how Christians should make sense of the Old Testament in terms of some of those things. So they were particularly concerned with God commanding Joshua to go into the land of Canaan and kill everything in sight, women, babies, cattle, everything, just clean it out. And it seems so cruel. And so first thing to say is, I'm sure that in terms of just the superficial look of the God of the New Testament, God of the Old Testament, there's a gap. There's a gap. It's as if God's act got cleaned up right? But the picture I was getting from the Christian community nowadays, it wasn't just Catholics. It was Calvinists and Catholics and a bunch of different people. The sense I was getting is that it's all our Bible. We have to make sense of it. It's not just a different God. It's a different side of God, maybe. So how do we make sense of this? God's cruelty and the way he treats his enemies and so on. So I was I got a kick out of this because they invited me to give the last session, and my story was, you guys are excited about how God can treat his enemies that way. Look at the way he treats his beloved, as with Job and Abraham. Tells Abraham to kill his son. That's really about as low as it gets. So what's that about? So I gave a talk about this. It's on YouTube if anybody wants to see it. 3 parts, or you can ask me and I'll send you the links. I also wrote it up as a paper, and it's in a book. But a friend of mine who was there said the talk was much better than the paper. So there you go. Okay. Yeah. So I think a lot of Christian thinking, you guys can correct me because you know much more about this than I do, for sure. A lot of Christian thinking nowadays doesn't want to separate the two that sharply, as you were suggesting.
Yeah. I mean, just from my individual personal experience, I mean, for example, when we were studying the Bible, it's not like we only studied the New Testament. We spent just as much time on the Old Testament. And obviously there are, you could say, difficulties with reconciling the unity of something like the Trinity beyond just the philosophical aspects of it. I mean, long story short, it's difficult and it's probably not going to ever be perfectly done.
Yeah.
Is the take I get.
Yeah.
But
so the way I learned to read the Bible, there's no Trinity at all in the Old Testament. When Christians read the Bible, they see it in various places. So I'm teaching philosophy of religion. And I have a student who's a Coptic Christian, and she's very religious, and she talks like her way of looking at it is the only way. And I haven't yet told her it's not, but she was talking about various, Christian symbols in the Old Testament. And I think, of course, they read it that way, and that's fine. It's a different reading of the text. Yeah. Let me mention an issue that's philosophical and theological. So from ancient times, the problem of evil has been a big deal. How can God be perfectly good given what goes on? Never mind the text of the Bible, leave that out for now, but just what goes on in the world. There are famines and there's cancer and there's, if you forgive me, Trump. There's a lot of stuff in the world that couldn't be. Never mind that God is perfectly good. Even if he was pretty good, it's hard to see how the world could be like this. I sometimes envisage an episode of Star Trek where you're told you're going to be taken to a galaxy that is ruled by a good God, not necessarily perfectly good, just a good God who cares. And then you get on this rocket ship and it takes you here and you say, what? So the problem of evil has been a big deal. So atheists raise it as a refutation of religion. And religious people, and I saw this, that conference at Notre Dame, religious people have answers. And I don't like any of those answers. They seem to me crazy. So you'll say, well, there's evil because God wants to give you free will and then he can't control you. Okay, so philosophers really get into this. And then you think, okay, so that at best that explains moral evil. And so there are a million answers and questions. And, there's a Talmudic expression that the question is better than the answer. I feel like that's absolutely true of the answers given that are called theodicy, right? So I'm reading something with the students this quarter, and he says something like, let's see, I don't know if I can find it at the moment. He puts the whole thing in a completely different perspective, not as an argument for or against religion, but just that the kind of creatures we are we're very dependent on an external world, on a world. And that's what makes possible the joys of human life and also the suffering. And that's just bottom line. That's the way life is. And somehow it's a different perspective. It's a different way to get started thinking about evil. Right? Anyway. Okay, what else? Kevin, I liked your question a lot. It was good. Anybody?
I can follow up with something kind of off of what Kevin said. So it sounds like we'd like to look at God as the same character in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So if that is true, if
and the Quran too, right?
Yeah, so I think that's a good place to start. We can go with that. Do you think God has a character arc then? Because
a character what? Arc?
Character arc. Is he a static character throughout?
That's really great. That's a great question.
So I'd like to hear what you think.
Yeah, there's a friend of mine named Jack Miles. You know this name, anybody? He's a writer, and he started as a Jesuit priest, and he was sent by the Vatican to study in Jerusalem, to be their guy on the Old Testament, and he knows Hebrew and stuff. And eventually, he told me it really shook him up to be in Jerusalem. We can talk about that, but anyway, he ended up wanting to write. He ended up dropping out of the church, and he's a religious person. He's a kind of liberal Protestant, and he wanted to write a book about the Bible, and the Bible for him meant the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as he got into it, he realized he had to write two books. One of them is on what he calls Tanakh, which is the Hebrew acronym for what you call the Old Testament. And he had to tell us its story in its own terms, in a completely different way. And he approached the Christian Bible. It's the second book is called Christ. The first book is called God, a Biography, which connects to what you were talking about. We'll come back to it in a second. So the second book is telling the story from the beginning in Genesis through the New Testament through a Christian lens. Okay, and he sees it as a completely new interpretation of what was there from before. And before there was its own interpretation. There was an interpretation that, and he says, if you really did now, and this is all so far the Old Testament, he says that we think of God as static, as perfect and static. But if you read the text, this is like what I said before about various properties of God. If you read the text, it doesn't sound static at all. Starts in a certain place. And that story I told you about Hosea, about marrying a whore, that couldn't have occurred in Genesis, right? That's not the character. So it'd be interesting to think about the character developing over time. And that book does it. That's what the book is about. It's called God, a Biography. It's an attempt to make good on that kind of idea.
But can a perfect person or being change? Is there only one
right
avenue to perfection? I guess that's what I would say.
So perfection is an issue. I mean, my feeling about the God of the Old Testament, perfect doesn't spring to mind, right? If you look at Psalms, the Bible is loaded with poetry or poetically infused narrative. And if you look at Psalms, somebody will find a passage in which it says God is perfect, but it's poetry. In poetry, you say of your beloved that he or she is perfect, right? So it's not a theoretical document about God's properties, right? I don't know how to do this. I have a friend who teaches philosophy somewhere in North Carolina, I think, at a small liberal arts college. And he once tweeted me and said, how did we get from mystery to perfection? No, how do we get from mystery to certainty? Because the God of the Old Testament is mysterious. And in a way, we all think that God is mysterious, right? That we're over our head when we try to figure this out, right? And yet somehow emerging from the tradition are doctrines about which you have to believe this one exactly to be saved. And if you're in that church, you're not. It's a whole different thing, kind of. And so I'm happy to stick with the mystery myself. This is not to argue against anybody. I mean, it's not to put down anybody else's way, but I was on a panel in Riverside, an interfaith panel with an imam and a Catholic priest and a minister, I think. And the imam challenged us to say what we think about God's justice, because in Islam, that's a giant topic and a serious topic. And you need to see the world, God and the world as just, if I'm getting it right. And he said, what do you think about that? It was like a challenge to the panel. Tell us what you think about that. So I couldn't resist this. There's a Woody Allen joke where he's thinking about the problem of evil and he says, God is an underachiever. So I told him that and he didn't laugh. And then I felt terrible because I thought maybe I insulted him. So I went up to him afterwards and I said, I was making a joke. I'm really sorry if it offended you in any way. And he started to laugh, but he didn't want to laugh in public about it, kind of, I think.
Well, so if I may, along the lines of...
You may.
Thank you. So along the lines of the point about mystery that you're making, and in keeping with the idea of trying to differentiate yourself from these like deep theological doctrinal positions, I wonder what you think mystics are up to. And
that's a good question.
And how that relates to you.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was stunned when you said you're a Wettstein disciple. I feel like I'm a Rotem fan.
Well, it's mutual.
Good. So there's a tradition in Jewish culture called midrash. Does anybody know that word? It's a word that's around in literary circles too. It became a kind of hot topic. And it comes from a Hebrew word that means explanation or inquiry. And there's a tradition of rabbis and scholars from roughly from the time of Jesus for the next, 600 years, maybe the time of the Talmud, of them sitting around and talking about the meaning of the text. And there are books recording this. And it's really interesting because there's also a tradition of serious commentary on the text, just as there is in Christianity and Islam. But this is not that. This is more like imaginative remarks about the text. Now, these people were masters of the whole corpus. They had at their fingertips passages in every one of the texts. And so they would relate something here to something there to something there. They would find jokes. They'd make funny comments about the connections between things. There'd be moral exhortations. It's all kinds of stuff all over the place, miscellaneous. And the American poet Robert Bly, who grew up in Lutheran Minnesota, in Lutheranism in Minnesota, gave a talk in which he said the Christian community is somewhat impoverished by not having such a thing because it's so rich. And if you look, I think it's in Islam too. Is hadith the word for that? I don't know. Not sure. But anyway, so if you read this, it's really very interesting. It goes in all directions, just like comments that are miscellaneous and here and there, and stories, a lot of stories. Now, in the most communities, they'll take it very seriously and take the stories to be things that happened. Right. But you don't have to do that. You can kind of just get a lot out of it. It's very rich. Then there's another tradition of mysticism, and that's what you were asking about. So probably this goes back to the same period, but the main texts are developed in medieval times, not before. And they're sometimes attributed back to early times. They'll say this was written back when, but really it wasn't. It was from medieval times. And the mystics are, let me give you an example of a mystical idea. That God, in creating the world, had to shrink himself in order to make room for the world. Okay. Another kind of mystical idea that there are spheres, heavenly spheres, and I don't even know how to begin to do this, but it's very woo stuff. And I think of it as poetry on poetry. In other words, the midrash is often poetry. It's sort of making up a story to go along with the text or filling in a gap in the text by imagination, right? Where some people will say, oh, it's not imagination, it's very serious, that's what happened. But really, I think it's imagination. Midrash is a whole level removed from this. It's very imaginative, a kind of mythology that has a special character. And I try to give you a little flavor of that by talking about the God story about shrinking himself. And it became, there was a guy here who was in the philosophy department, then became a dean, and then he went to UCLA. He was an expert on Christian midrash. Okay, because the Christians took it over and made something also of it. So the various mystical traditions, and I believe in Islam there's mystical traditions too. Now, some people take those to be literally right, that God is composed of these spheres and they have connections to each other. And one sphere might be called loving kindness, and another one might be called wisdom. And I don't know this stuff from the inside. Anyway, so I think of it as a kind of further poetic expansion on the texts themselves.
Okay, so I was interested in mysticism, say like Kabbalah and Sufism and things like this.
Yeah, it's called Kabbalah in Hebrew, which means something like inherited tradition or something like that, right?
Received.
Yeah. Received. Yeah, and Sufism has mystical sides too. Yes.
Yeah, but so I was bringing them up more because I figured that whatever access or interaction they must be having with God is much less about any kind of doctrinal understanding or belief.
Absolutely, right.
And would have to be much closer to this side of faith and kind of ecstatic awe and something like that.
Right. So I could tell you, right, very good, very good. So the Talmud is a codification, not a codification really, a writing down of discussions of the rabbis from the time of Jesus for about 600 years, writing down the oral tradition. It's supposed to be kept alive orally, but they feared that it would get lost. So they started to write it down in various stages. And the study of the Talmud, it's a legal document. It's a little like church canon law. But it's mixed up because it's canon law and then it's midrash thrown in the middle and stories and jokes and sort of theological ideas, and it's all over the place. And I do a lot of time I spend a lot of time studying the Talmud. It's the most fantastic thing I've ever studied. And it was very good training for the legal parts are very good training for analytic philosophy. Now, why did I tell you this? Right. So there's a kind of tradition of scholarship.
It's 5 o'clock.
Okay, there's a tradition of scholarship, of learning, studying Talmud. Rabbis are not theologically trained, by the way. They're trained in Talmud, right? It's very different than priests in this way. And sometime about 300 years ago, 400 years ago in Europe, a movement started called Hasidism, which was a movement of people who thought that God should be accessible to ordinary people without great scholarship. And it was often done by way of mystical things, right? Whereas if a scholarly type looked at this, they'd say, what the hell are you talking about, right? But it was ecstatic and that kind of thing. Music and dance and this poetry. I don't know, they wouldn't call it poetry, but I think it's like poetry. So the Hasidic tradition is very engaged with the mystical side. And I think you find parallels to a lot of these things in other religions as well. I just don't know them so well.
So would you say that your engagement with God is mystical?
Whew. Okay, let me take a drink before I could. It's not a real drink, it's coffee. So there was a writer in the 20th century who used the expression normal mysticism for something that I connect with. His was something he was worried about. He was worried about the fact that religion seems to require anthropomorphism. That is, if you just have God as a perfect being, well, what's religion without love and caring and a bunch of things that are anthropomorphic, that are human in a certain way, right? So if you're serious about prayer, you're asking for things that you care about. Now, so he thought that's a very important part of religion. At the same time, there's the intuition that somehow God is beyond all that, that we're talking about something that isn't just characterized by the human-ish properties, right? And he felt like, this writer says, the rabbis, meaning from the time of Jesus through 600 years later, didn't really have a conception of God, which is a very interesting comment to me. I like it a lot. They had the experience in prayer, in seeing the natural world, in interacting with other people. They had the experience of God. And he said that experience has two kinds of sides that don't fit very well together. One of them is anthropomorphic. I feel like he's being generous to me or angry or whatever it may be. And the other side is I feel somehow that putting it that way is very human, and somehow what we're talking about is probably beyond all that. And he said they were not theorists, these rabbis, right? They didn't actually sit back and say, okay, now let's be philosophers. How do we put together those two ideas in one being, right? They were kind of fashioning a practice, a way of being in the world. And the religious way of being in the world had this thing in it that was not to be theorized, kind of, in a way. It had these two parts. And he said, if you experience the world, if you experience God in the world, that's kind of mysticism, just normal, he called it, normal mysticism. It's not mysticism with spheres or with, all kinds of apparatus, as in, Kabbalah or Christian mysticism. Anyway, yeah. You notice the Bible never proves that God exists. It's not even a question, right? The medievals it becomes very big. There's a philosopher named, who I think he died recently, named Alvin Plantinga. He was my colleague at Notre Dame. He was a very devout Calvinist. And he told me once there are 32 proofs for the existence of God. And I said to him, we were on a plane going somewhere together. And I said to him, that's funny because I know the basic 5 and I don't think they work.
Just to sort of interject as well, it is just a little bit past 5.
Oh, I don't mind. Whatever, you know.
Yeah, that's our typical ending time. So I just wanted to give everyone an opportunity. If you have any final questions, feel free to ask them.
Sure.
I don't want to end on anyone. And then
I can stick around too, so it's not.
Yeah, perfect. So if anyone has any final questions, feel free.
Hey, sorry, a long comment back, you mentioned something about like God being like an underachiever or just doing just enough.
Yeah.
I was like an Alan Wood something, Alan Wood joke, something. And I took Schwitzgill's Evils class. Woody Allen, sorry, yeah. I took Schwitzgill's Evils class in my first quarter of UCR, and that reminded me of some Eastern Schwitzgable.
Schwitzgable.
Yeah, Schwitzgill's Evil class.
Mhm.
I know you teach Evil too. I think you taught it
Yes.
last winter quarter.
Yes.
And it kind of reminded me of one of Schwitzgill's theories. I forgot which Eastern philosopher, either Mengzi Shunzi or someone else, on that morality, we commit morality at a C way, at like a C student rate. Like we do just enough to get by.
Say it again.
We when it comes to morality, we do things only at like just enough to pass by, rather than like out of our way. Like if you read like Peter Singer, you don't go donating a lot of money. You don't like become vegetarian, or most people don't. So you recognize all these ethical things you should do, which would make you like an A to B student. We just don't, just to get by. So with God, in some sense, be underrated in that mention. Sorry, it's a really weird question. I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's very interesting. So on one hand, somehow I don't work with any kind of definition of God, but there are a lot of associations that are very important. One kind of association is kind of the perfection of human excellences. That's one kind of idea we employ sometimes when we think about God. We don't always think this way. I was just giving examples where we don't, but that's kind of an idea. And on the other hand, when you look at the world, that doesn't work so well, right? And when you read the Bible, the Old Testament at least, it doesn't work so well. At the same time, God is to be revered. And that's really, see, if you really focused on the perfection picture, omniscience and omnipotence and all the rest, it's easy to see why you would be awestruck. Right. But it's not so easy to see the other side, the anthropomorphic side. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Other comments comments are good. They don't have to be questions. They could be any just a reflection you have or.
Well, I'm not sure how I would categorize whatever it is I'm about to spew out now, either as a question or comment.
I know the feeling.
This also was addressing something that was brought up quite a while back, but I'm a very slow thinker, so it took a long time to kind of consider how I wanted to ask/comment. I guess it kind of goes to what Kevin and Omar had brought up. And what, as best I recall, they had to do with the character arc of God.
Yes.
And an attempt at some sort of reconciliation between the Old Testament picture versus the New Testament picture. I'm wondering if within Kevin's and Omar's and literally anyone else through the centuries who has asked such a question, there's not kind of at least three questions hidden that need to be distinguished, whether you're asking about the actual essence of God, assuming you subscribe to such a thing, and whether or not that can change, whether or not our understanding of God could account for, different literary depictions and so forth, or whether or not, for whatever reason, God actually chooses to express himself differently over time. So that probably makes sense on its face for everyone else here who's probably far more intelligent than I am. But I guess the way I was thinking of it is, let's say the depiction of the Trojan War between Virgil and Homer, right, is a vastly different picture. And even though I think Homer on a linguistic level is probably vastly superior to Virgil, I think Virgil's understanding of, pietas is so much richer, now that he's had centuries to reflect on the myth of the Trojan War. So I guess that would be like our, understanding of God changing throughout time, still with reference to the same object, but, spoken of in new ways. And then the other way, kind of another analogy I was thinking of is Ptolemy and Einstein were both talking about astronomy, but one, simply got the better, because of centuries and centuries of study, new empirical data. Ptolemy was doing the best he could with what he had, right? And he's still talking about the universe, he's still talking about the solar system, they're still talking, they still have reference to that same object, but it's it's because of new horizons of epistemology and so forth that give you this different picture. I'm wondering, to bring that very long, whatever it was, tangent to a close, I'm wondering what, if you think the Old Testament, New Testament type picture, and the differentiation there, and could be accounted for to some degree, at least by something like this. Hopefully that all made sense.
Yeah, it did. It was very, very thoughtful. I really appreciate it. So I'm not sure what the this is, because there was a bunch of ideas that are all very rich ideas. So I mentioned before Maimonides, who was the kind of St. Thomas figure in Jewish tradition. He had a radical idea that the more fundamentalist types didn't like much. He was thinking about sacrifices and their rationale. And he said, God just told us to do that because we needed something closer to idolatry. And as the human community matured, it wasn't necessary anymore. Prayer replaces sacrifice. And of course, if you're more fundamentalist in your inclinations, you'll think, wait a minute, the Bible says to sacrifice. What are you talking about? Okay, so that's one kind of theme in what you were saying, that maybe God tells you what's relevant for you at the time. And that would be a way to explain various changes in the texts, I guess. Right? Another way would be to think that God learns over time and changes. Another way would be to think that we're talking about the same thing, but our conception of it changes. And these books are human documents that are responsive to the same God, but in different ways. So I guess there are a variety of ways to try to deal with this, right? I'm in a kind of funny place in my life because, one second. I'm not theologically very orthodox. I'm not theologically very fundamentalist, obviously. But when I look for a place, as it were, a church or synagogue, the only ones that I can stand are the most fundamentalist ones, because they really know how to pray and they really know how to pour their hearts out. Right. So those people in the more fundamentalist places see the Bible as God's word quite literally, not as our reflection of his word or our anything. Right. So I try not to get into theological discussions. On the other hand, the more liberal synagogues that I know about when I go to, they don't have a clue about prayer. Right. I mean, they're chatting it up and enjoying each other, and it's a different world. Guy who became a Jesuit. And I was telling him about my more naturalistic ideas about, that really don't fit with fundamentalist ways of thinking about these things. And he said, yeah, of course. And I said, wait, whoa. You're a priest. How can you kind of sit still for these things I'm saying? And he said, no, that's close to the way I think about it. I said, do you talk to your colleagues that way? So he said, yeah, of course. I said, do you talk in church that way? He said, no, they'd think I was a heretic. That's a deep comment, I feel like. There's a writer, I mentioned him before, I didn't mention his name, Robert Bella. Oh, no, I didn't mention him, actually. I mentioned somebody else. Robert Bella died in recent years. He was a Christian sociologist of religion. And he says in an article I like a lot that he studied the principles of faith of some of the main religions, the doctrines you have to believe. And he said, if you look at the fine print of these writers who developed these principles, it's much more sophisticated and complicated than what the principle sounds like. And so he says these principles were really for the people that have something to hang on to. Right. So I feel like really careful thought about these things gets very complicated and is not really very suited to, here's what I believe, blah, blah, blah. I was talking, I'm telling you all these stories about my own community because that's the only one I know, and I'm happy to hear other people. But there's a guy in LA, a rabbi in LA, who wrote an article in which he said, I don't care if the Exodus really happened. And they went crazy. The community went nuts because what do you mean? The Bible says it. What are you talking about? So the more orthodox types were offended. So then I go to Israel quite a bit, and I study there every summer in Jerusalem. And I love going there. It's really special for me. And I have friends on all sides of the political lines, and I have Palestinian friends, and it's just a rich time for me when I get a chance to go there. But I had lunch with this woman who's very Orthodox scholar and knows a huge amount of stuff. And she said to me, what do they care if it exactly happened? And I thought, whoa, right? I mean, she was saying, it's not of the deepest concern to me whether the Exodus actually happened or these stories are actual factual stories. Doesn't matter. I resonate with that, but you couldn't say that in certain circles without getting in trouble. And it was interesting to me that there was a kind of freedom of thought in Jerusalem that wasn't true in LA. Because they were home with it in a certain way. Any other thoughts?
So I, like you, try to stay a naturalist when I can.
It's
So-
like what Nicholas was saying about the morality, we're all trying.
Yeah, I find it difficult at times, but I find the easiest way to dispel mysticism or dispel the supernatural from religion is to psychologize it. Do you think that's what you do?
So give me an example.
So I think the way that I'm most accustomed to reading religious texts, since I didn't grow up religious, is in psychological terms. So I like to look at it in terms of what is this expressing about the humans that wrote it? What is this expressing about humanity, rather than what is this trying to tell us about the supernatural? I don't always find it easy, but I try to do that.
Yeah.
Do you think that's what you do?
No, that's standard religious people do that too. What is it trying to tell us about human psychology and stuff? But for me, it's doing something else. It's making available worship. Worship is a different thing than thinking about what it says about us. In other words, when I pray, I'm doing this soliloquy thing. I'm talking from my heart to God, whatever, however you, or the universe, or whatever you. It's very important to me that I'm doing that. When I don't know, I think as I get older, I see wonders all over the place. And there are moments of, I don't know if you'd call them worship or what, but there are moments of just being stunned and awestruck by the wonders. And it happens more and more. There's a line about, there's an idea about, and this is again a Jewish thing, but that's the only one I know, making blessings. We make blessings on all kinds of things, on food, different blessings for different kinds of food. We make blessings when we see a beautiful person. We make blessings when we see a great scholar. We make blessings when somebody dies. I mean, there's just a million of them. And somebody says, some 20th century character says that part of the function of the blessing is to make you stop and just reflect for a minute before you drink the water, or before you, when you see the ocean, you don't just glance at it, you stop and you express gratitude. Now, those things like worship, gratitude, all those awe, those are different things than what you were talking about, right? I don't mean you don't know about them. I'm sure you do, but no, I'm sure you do. But it's easy to think, well, it must be all psychological. We're learning, when you read the Bible, let's say we can get out of this about human character or whatever, and that's legitimate. But there's another side to it, which is the experience of worship or gratitude or regret or mourning.
But I guess my question is, how do you square those things without introducing the supernatural? The way that I think is the easiest way to do that is to psychologize it. Is that not what you?
No.
What are they if they're not psychological?
I think the taxonomy is too narrow, right? I think when I express gratitude, or when I appreciate these texts because they give me a way to worship, that's a really different kind of thing than giving a story about it that's psychological. I don't mean it's incompatible. It is compatible. The naturalism comes out maybe in my saying, I don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about God exactly. I know I can worship and I can be grateful. And it's, as it were, towards a person almost, but I know better than that. But past a certain point, I don't know better. I just can't go beyond that point. So I go back to that picture about normal mysticism. I think philosophy of religion for me is an attempt to get clear about these things, right? Clear as I can about these things, but it's not to resolve all these paradoxes. That's a different kind of quest. I don't have, yeah, there's another step here, but I'm not sure how to make it exactly. Anyway, these topics are, for me, completely fascinating.
Well, I think for tonight, I'll go ahead and end it out. We've had enough intense conversation. We can all go and dwell on this for hours.